I'm Sarah, 26 years old, and I never thought my sister would literally chain the door to stop me from boarding a plane to Hawaii. Standing here at airport security with bruised knuckles and a torn sweater, watching the TSA agent examine the scratches on my hands with obvious concern, I realize how insane this whole situation must look. Just 4 hours ago, I was in my driveway wrestling with Madison over my passport while she screamed about family loyalty and Christmas traditions. But what happened next made that fight look like child's play compared to the chaos that was about to unfold. Before we dive into this wild story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're ready for a tale of family drama that'll make your holiday disputes seem tame, smash that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable true stories. Trust me, you'll want to stick around because this Christmas saga is about to get absolutely crazy. Working double shifts as a registered nurse at Chicago General Hospital had finally paid off in ways I never expected. After 3 grueling years of saving every spare penny, skipping dinners out with friends, and wearing the same scrubs until they practically disintegrated, I had accumulated enough money for something I had dreamed about since childhood. A solo Christmas vacation to Hawaii. Not just any vacation, mind you, but 2 weeks at a beachfront resort in Maui where I could finally decompress from the emotional and physical exhaustion that had consumed my life since our parents died in that horrible car accident. Madison, my older sister at 29, had always been the one calling the shots in our family, even before Mom and Dad passed away. She possessed this uncanny ability to make everyone around her feel guilty for wanting anything that didn't align with her vision of how things should be. When our parents were alive, she would orchestrate every family gathering, every holiday celebration, every birthday party down to the smallest detail. She thrived on control, and everyone just went along with it because it was easier than arguing with her relentless persistence. After the funeral, Madison had seamlessly stepped into the role of unofficial family matriarch, despite the fact that I was a grown adult perfectly capable of making my own decisions. She lived in our childhood home, which she had inherited along with the larger portion of our parents' estate due to some complicated legal arrangements that I honestly never fully understood. I had moved into a small apartment closer to the hospital, grateful for the independence but somehow still finding myself constantly pulled back into Madison's web of family obligations and expectations. The engagement to Richard Pemberton had only amplified Madison's need for control and perfection. Richard came from old money, the kind of family that had country club memberships dating back generations and attended charity galas where a single table cost more than most people's monthly salary. His mother, Mrs. Victoria Hartwell Pemberton, was exactly the kind of woman you would expect from that background. She had opinions about everything from proper table settings to appropriate conversation topics, and she had made it abundantly clear that she expected Madison to organize flawless family gatherings that would reflect well on their soon-to-be merged families. When I announced my Hawaii plans during what was supposed to be a casual Sunday dinner at Madison's house, the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Madison's fork clattered against her plate as she stared at me with the kind of expression you might reserve for someone who had just announced they were joining a cult. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly sensing the tension but probably not understanding the full scope of what was about to unfold. Hawaii, Madison repeated slowly, as if the word itself was foreign and distasteful. During Christmas. Her voice carried that particular tone she used when she was trying to maintain her composure in front of Richard while simultaneously communicating her complete disapproval. Sarah, we've been planning this Christmas gathering for months. Mrs. Hartwell is expecting to meet the entire family. We've already ordered the custom floral arrangements and booked the catering service. I had anticipated this reaction, of course, but somehow hearing the actual words still felt like a punch to the stomach. Madison, you've been planning this gathering. I never agreed to spend my Christmas playing hostess to Richard's family. I've worked overtime for 3 years straight to save for this trip. I've already booked everything and requested the time off from work. The conversation quickly devolved from there, with Madison launching into a lengthy monologue about family responsibilities and how our parents would be disappointed if they knew I was abandoning family traditions. She brought up every sacrifice she had made since their death, every time she had stepped up to handle family obligations, every instance where she felt I had been selfish or ungrateful. Richard attempted to mediate, suggesting that perhaps they could adjust the Christmas plans to accommodate my absence, but Madison shut down that suggestion with a look that could have frozen lava. Our Aunt Helen, Mom's sister, was also at the dinner and initially tried to support my decision. She understood better than anyone how hard I had been working and how much I deserved a vacation. But as the evening wore on and Madison's arguments became more emotional and manipulative, I could see doubt creeping into Aunt Helen's expression. By the time we left that night, even she was questioning whether I was being reasonable. My cousin Jake, who was Aunt Helen's son and had always been somewhat of a neutral party in family conflicts, remained mostly silent during the entire discussion. He nodded politely when addressed but avoided taking sides, which I had expected. Jake had his own complicated relationship with family drama and generally tried to stay out of disputes that didn't directly affect him. The real trouble started 3 days after that disastrous Sunday dinner when my supervisor at the hospital, Janet Morrison, called me into her office with a concerned expression that immediately set off alarm bells in my head. Janet was typically straightforward and professional, but that morning she seemed genuinely worried as she asked me to sit down and explain what was happening with my family situation. "Sarah, I received a very troubling phone call yesterday from someone claiming to be your sister," Janet began, consulting the notes she had written on a legal pad. "She said there was a serious family emergency and that you might need to cancel your vacation time to deal with some kind of crisis. She mentioned something about mental health concerns and suggested that perhaps taking time off right now wasn't in your best interest." My blood pressure spiked as I realized exactly what Madison had done. She had actually called my workplace and attempted to sabotage my vacation by fabricating a family emergency. The audacity of it was breathtaking, even for someone who had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation. I had to spend 40 minutes explaining to Janet that there was no emergency, that my sister was trying to pressure me into attending a family gathering, and that my mental health was perfectly fine despite what Madison might have implied. Janet was understanding but clearly concerned about the family dynamics that would drive someone to make such a call. She ultimately agreed to honor my original vacation request, but I could see that the entire situation had raised red flags about my personal life that would probably follow me for months. The professional embarrassment of having to explain my sister's behavior to my supervisor was almost unbearable. The phone calls to other family members started shortly after that. Madison had embarked on a systematic campaign to turn everyone against my Hawaii plans by framing them as evidence of my selfishness and disregard for family unity. She called our elderly great-aunt Martha, who lived in a nursing home and barely understood modern technology, much less the nuances of family vacation planning. She reached out to distant cousins who hadn't spoken to our immediate family in years, suddenly reconnecting with them specifically to share her concerns about my behavior. The family group chat, which had been created originally to coordinate holiday plans and share photos, became a constant stream of passive-aggressive messages about the importance of family togetherness during the holidays. Madison would post inspirational quotes about family loyalty, share memories from past Christmases when everyone was present, and make subtle references to people who put their own desires ahead of their family's needs. She never mentioned me by name, but the intended target of these messages was crystal clear to everyone involved. Mrs. Hartwell joined the campaign with the kind of sophisticated social pressure that only comes from decades of high society manipulation. She began calling me directly, ostensibly to get to know her future sister-in-law better, but actually to express her concern about how my absence would affect the family dynamics she was hoping to experience. She spoke in carefully measured tones about the importance of first impressions and how much she was looking forward to seeing how our family interacted during the holidays. The first major public confrontation happened at what was supposed to be a casual family dinner at a local restaurant to celebrate Jake's birthday. I should have known something was wrong when Madison insisted on choosing the restaurant and specifically requested a large table despite the relatively small guest list. She had orchestrated the entire evening as a stage for publicly shaming me about my travel plans. Halfway through the main course, Madison stood up and asked for everyone's attention because she had something important to discuss. My stomach dropped as I realized what was about to happen, but there was no graceful way to escape without making the situation even worse. She launched into a carefully rehearsed speech about family values, about how difficult the holidays had been since our parents died, and about how important it was for everyone to come together during this challenging time. "I'm sure everyone here understands how much our Christmas gathering means to me," Madison said, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotion but which I recognized as calculated manipulation. "It's been so hard planning everything without Mom's guidance, trying to create new traditions while honoring the old ones. I just hope that everyone in our family can find it in their hearts to prioritize our time together over other commitments." The implications were unmistakable, and everyone at the table turned to look at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to obvious disapproval. I felt completely ambushed and humiliated, but attempting to defend myself in that setting would have only made things worse. I mumbled something about needing to use the restroom and escaped to the parking lot, where I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to compose myself before driving home. The final straw in this phase of Madison's campaign came when I discovered that she had been intercepting my mail. I had been expecting some travel documents and confirmations from my travel agent, but when they failed to arrive on schedule, I called to inquire about the delay. The agent seemed confused and informed me that everything had been mailed to my address over a week ago. When I pressed for details, she mentioned that someone matching Madison's description had actually called to verify my address, claiming to be calling on my behalf because I was out of town. That evening, I drove to Madison's house and demanded to know what had happened to my mail. She initially denied any involvement, but when I threatened to file a complaint with the Postal Service about mail theft, she finally admitted that she had been collecting my mail to keep it safe while I was working such long hours. She produced a small stack of envelopes from a kitchen drawer, all of them opened and resealed with clear tape. "I was worried you might miss something important," she said, not even attempting to sound convincing. "You've been so stressed lately, and I thought maybe if you had some time to think about things without the pressure of all these travel arrangements, you might reconsider your decision." Standing in her kitchen, looking at my violated mail and listening to her pathetic justifications, I realized that this conflict was going to get much worse before it got better. Madison wasn't just disappointed about Christmas plans, she was willing to commit federal crimes to get her way. The discovery of Madison's mail interference marked a turning point in what had started as a simple disagreement about holiday plans. I spent a sleepless night trying to decide how to respond to what was clearly criminal behavior, ultimately settling on a direct confrontation that I hoped might shock her into recognizing how far she had crossed the line. Unfortunately, I had severely underestimated both her desperation and her willingness to escalate the situation. I decided to confront Madison at her workplace rather than her home, thinking that the professional setting might encourage her to maintain some level of rationality and restraint. Madison worked as a real estate agent for Pemberton Properties, which was coincidentally owned by Richard's family. The office occupied the ground floor of a restored Victorian building downtown, with polished hardwood floors and tasteful antique furniture that projected an image of established respectability and success. When I arrived that Tuesday morning around 10, Madison was in the middle of what appeared to be an important client consultation. I waited in the reception area for nearly 30 minutes, growing more agitated as I watched her through the glass partition, gesturing enthusiastically as she showed property photos to a well-dressed elderly couple. When she finally emerged and saw me sitting there, her expression shifted immediately from professional charm to barely concealed irritation. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" she asked in a whisper that somehow managed to sound both welcoming and threatening at the same time. "I'm with clients right now. If you need to talk, we should schedule something for later." "We need to talk about the mail you stole from my apartment," I replied, making no effort to lower my voice. "And about the phone call you made to my supervisor. And about whatever other sabotage you're planning to keep me from going to Hawaii." The conversation quickly spiraled out of control as Madison alternated between denying my accusations and justifying her actions as necessary interventions to help me make better decisions. Her voice rose as she became more defensive, and soon we were engaged in a full-blown argument in the middle of her workplace lobby. Other agents and clients began to stare, and I could see Madison's professional composure cracking under the pressure of public scrutiny. "You're being completely irrational about this," Madison said loudly enough for everyone in the office to hear. "I'm trying to help you understand that your behavior has been erratic and concerning. Maybe instead of attacking me, you should be grateful that someone cares enough about you to intervene when you're making obviously poor decisions." The implication that I was mentally unstable, delivered in front of her colleagues and clients, was so infuriating that I momentarily lost control of my own voice. "The only poor decision I'm making is continuing to have a relationship with someone who thinks mail theft and workplace harassment are acceptable ways to get what they want," I shouted back, causing several people to physically step back from our confrontation. Madison's response was to burst into tears and claim that I was having some kind of breakdown that was frightening her. She told everyone within earshot that she was worried about my mental health and that my behavior had been increasingly unstable since I announced my travel plans. Several of her coworkers immediately came to her defense, offering tissues and supportive comments while looking at me with obvious suspicion and disapproval. I left the office feeling humiliated and defeated, knowing that Madison had successfully positioned herself as the victim while making me look like an unstable aggressor. The professional embarrassment of causing a scene at her workplace was bad enough, but the way she had manipulated the situation to gain sympathy while painting me as mentally ill was particularly devastating. Madison's retaliation for my workplace confrontation was swift and ruthless. Within 24 hours, she had contacted every member of our extended family to share her concerns about my mental health and to suggest that my insistence on traveling alone to Hawaii was evidence of some kind of psychological crisis. She spoke to our elderly relatives with particular effectiveness, using language that suggested I was having a nervous breakdown and needed family intervention rather than enabling. The impact on my relationship with Aunt Helen was particularly painful. Helen called me the next evening, her voice filled with genuine concern and confusion. "Sarah, honey, Madison is very worried about you. She thinks maybe you've been under too much stress at work and that this Hawaii trip might not be the best idea right now. She mentioned that you've been having trouble sleeping and that you seemed agitated and confrontational when you visited her office." Hearing these lies from someone I loved and respected was devastating. I spent over an hour on the phone with Aunt Helen, trying to explain what had really happened and to convince her that Madison was deliberately distorting the truth. But I could hear the doubt in her voice, and I realized that Madison's strategy of questioning my mental health was working exactly as she had intended. "Maybe she's right about taking some time to think things over," Aunt Helen said gently. "You have been through so much since your parents died, and sometimes we don't realize how stress affects us until someone else points it out. Maybe instead of Hawaii, you could consider some therapy sessions or a nice quiet staycation where family could check on you." The suggestion that I needed therapy instead of a vacation was so absurd that I almost laughed, but I knew that arguing too forcefully would only reinforce Madison's narrative about my mental instability. I ended the call feeling more isolated and frustrated than ever, knowing that Madison had successfully poisoned my relationship with one of the few family members I had always counted on for support. The financial sabotage attempt came 3 days later when I received an automated call from my bank's fraud protection department asking me to verify some unusual account activity. When I called back to investigate, I learned that someone had attempted to access the shared account that contained assets from our parents' estate. The attempt had been made using personal information that would have been available to Madison through the estate paperwork, and the caller had claimed to be acting on my behalf to consolidate accounts for easier management. The bank representative was professional but clearly concerned about the potential fraud attempt. "The caller knew quite a bit of personal information about both you and the account, but something about the request seemed irregular, which is why our security protocols flagged it for review. We're required to notify all account holders when there's any attempt to make changes or access funds." I immediately drove to the bank to review the security footage and to place additional protections on all of my accounts. The grainy video showed someone who could have been Madison, but the image quality was too poor to be definitive. What was clear, however, was that someone was willing to commit financial fraud to interfere with my travel plans, and Madison was the only person with both the motive and the necessary information to attempt such a crime. The revelation about the financial sabotage attempt prompted me to reach out to Jake, hoping that he might be willing to serve as a neutral mediator or at least provide some insight into Madison's increasingly erratic behavior. I had always considered Jake to be relatively level-headed, and his position as Aunt Helen's son gave him a certain credibility within the family that might prove useful in resolving the situation. When I called Jake and explained what had been happening, his response surprised me with its immediate intensity and apparent insider knowledge. "Sarah, I think there's a lot more going on here than you realize," he said in a voice that carried an urgency I had never heard from him before. "Can you meet me somewhere private where we can talk without anyone else knowing about it? I mean somewhere completely away from family members or places where Madison might show up." We arranged to meet at a coffee shop on the other side of town, far from any location where Madison or other family members were likely to appear. Jake arrived looking nervous and frequently checking his phone, behavior that immediately put me on edge about what he was planning to reveal. He ordered a large coffee and asked me to sit at a table in the back corner where our conversation would be unlikely to be overheard. "Madison isn't just trying to ruin your Christmas vacation," Jake began without any preliminary pleasantries. "She's been planning to use your absence as an opportunity to finalize some kind of legal action regarding the inheritance from your parents' estate. I don't understand all the details, but I overheard her talking to Richard about how much easier it would be to handle certain paperwork if you weren't around to ask questions or object to anything." The information hit me like a physical blow. The idea that Madison might be planning to manipulate the estate assets while I was out of the country had never occurred to me, but it explained the intensity of her opposition to my travel plans and her willingness to resort to increasingly desperate measures to stop me. Jake continued talking, but I found it difficult to focus on his words as the implications of what he was saying began to sink in. "I think she's been working on this for months," Jake continued. "She's had several meetings with lawyers that she's tried to keep secret from the family. And I know she's been having money problems that she hasn't told Richard about. Something about debts from before they got engaged that she's been hiding." Jake offered to help me investigate what Madison was planning, but he insisted that we needed concrete evidence before making any accusations. He suggested that we try to find copies of the legal documents she had been working on, or at least get more information about the meetings with lawyers. His willingness to help felt like the first positive development in weeks of increasingly hopeless conflict. Over the next several days, Jake and I worked together to piece together information about Madison's activities. We discovered that she had scheduled several appointments with the law firm that had handled our parents' estate, always during times when I would be working and unavailable to attend. She had also been researching property values for our childhood home, which suggested that she might be planning to sell it despite the fact that it was supposed to remain in the family according to our parents' wishes. The most damaging evidence came from Jake's careful investigation of Madison's financial situation. Using his connections from college and his work in banking, he was able to uncover information suggesting that Madison had accumulated significant credit card debt and had taken out a personal loan using the family home as collateral. If she was unable to repay these debts, the bank could potentially foreclose on the property that contained so many of our childhood memories. "She's desperate," Jake explained during one of our clandestine meetings. "If she can't find a way to pay off these debts soon, she could lose everything. But if she can gain control of your share of the inheritance, she'll have enough money to clear the debts and still have plenty left over for her wedding and her future with Richard." Armed with this information, I felt confident that I could confront Madison with evidence of her schemes and force her to abandon her sabotage efforts. Jake agreed to serve as a witness to our confrontation, and we arranged to meet with Madison at her house to present what we had discovered and to demand that she stop interfering with my travel plans. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening when Richard would be out of town on business, ensuring that we could speak freely without outside interference. I arrived at Madison's house feeling nervous but determined, carrying a folder containing copies of all the evidence Jake and I had assembled. Jake was supposed to arrive 15 minutes after me to provide backup and to serve as a neutral witness to whatever Madison might say in response to our accusations. Madison seemed surprisingly calm when I arrived, almost as if she had been expecting this confrontation. She offered me coffee and suggested that we sit in the living room where we could talk comfortably. Her relaxed demeanor made me suspicious, but I proceeded with my planned presentation of the evidence, laying out everything Jake and I had discovered about her financial problems and her meetings with lawyers. "Madison, I know what you've been planning," I said, opening the folder and spreading documents across her coffee table. "I know about the debts, the meetings with lawyers, and your plans to manipulate the estate while I'm in Hawaii. This has to stop. If you're having financial problems, we can work together to find a solution, but I'm not going to let you steal my inheritance to cover debts you accumulated without telling anyone." Madison's response was to smile slightly and check her watch. "Sarah, I think you should know that Jake has been keeping me informed about your investigation from the very beginning. Every meeting you had with him, every piece of information you thought you were gathering secretly, every plan you made to confront me. I've known about all of it. The betrayal was so complete and unexpected that I felt physically sick." Jake had been reporting back to Madison throughout our entire investigation, feeding her information about my plans and helping her stay one step ahead of my efforts to stop her. When he arrived 15 minutes later as scheduled, he avoided making eye contact with me and positioned himself clearly on Madison's side of the room. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Jake said quietly. "But Madison convinced me that you really weren't thinking clearly about any of this. She showed me text messages and emails that made it seem like you were becoming paranoid and potentially dangerous. I thought I was helping both of you by making sure she knew what you were planning." Madison had not only manipulated Jake into betraying me, but she had also used his cooperation to accelerate her timeline for whatever legal actions she was planning. While I had been focused on gathering evidence against her, she had been using my investigation to refine her own plans and to eliminate any remaining obstacles to their success. "I've scheduled the house sale for the week you're supposed to be in Hawaii," Madison announced with obvious satisfaction. "The buyers are very motivated and willing to close quickly. By the time you get back from your vacation, assuming you still decide to go, everything will be finalized and the proceeds will be distributed according to the legal agreements." I realized in that moment that I was completely isolated from any family support and that Madison had successfully outmaneuvered every attempt I had made to stop her. The trip to Hawaii, which had started as a simple vacation plan, had become a catalyst for the complete destruction of our family relationships and the theft of my inheritance. The discovery of Jake's betrayal left me feeling completely alone and desperate as my departure date approached. Madison had successfully isolated me from all family support while accelerating her plans to steal my inheritance, and I was running out of both time and options to stop her. With only 5 days left before my scheduled flight, I decided to take increasingly drastic measures to protect myself and to prevent Madison from completing her schemes. My first attempt to leave early for Hawaii was thwarted when I discovered that Madison had somehow arranged to have my car towed from the airport parking lot where I had left it the night before my original departure date. When I called the towing company to retrieve it, I learned that someone had reported it as abandoned and possibly stolen, providing enough personal information about me to make the report seem legitimate. The fees for retrieving my car, combined with the cost of changing my flight to an earlier departure, would have consumed most of my remaining travel budget. Instead of going to the airport, I returned to my apartment to regroup and to try a different approach. I was surprised to find Madison waiting in the parking lot outside my building, sitting in her car with the engine running as if she had been there for hours. When she saw me approaching, she got out of her car and positioned herself directly in my path, making it clear that she intended to have another confrontation. "Sarah, we need to talk about this situation before it gets completely out of hand," Madison said in a voice that sounded reasonable but carried an undertone of threat. "I think we've both said and done things that we regret, and I'd like to find a way to work things out that doesn't destroy our family relationships permanently." I was in no mood for another round of Madison's manipulation, especially after discovering the extent of her planning and the involvement of Jake in her schemes. The only thing I want to discuss is when you're going to return my share of the inheritance and stop interfering with my travel plans, I replied, trying to move around her toward the building entrance. Madison stepped sideways to block my path again, this time placing her hand on my arm to physically prevent me from walking away. "You're not thinking clearly about any of this," she said with the kind of patronizing tone that had always infuriated me even when we were children. "I'm trying to protect you from making decisions that you'll regret later. Can't you see that this obsession with Hawaii is just a way of avoiding dealing with your real problems?" The physical contact and the accusation that I was mentally unstable triggered an immediate anger response that I had been suppressing for weeks. I pulled my arm away from her grip with enough force to make her stumble backward, and for the first time in our entire conflict, I raised my voice to match the intensity of my frustration. "The only problem I have is a sister who thinks she can steal my inheritance and control my life," I shouted loud enough to attract attention from other residents who were entering and leaving the building. "I'm going to Hawaii, Madison. I'm going to enjoy my vacation while you explain to Richard and his mother why you've been lying about your finances and forging legal documents." Madison's response was to grab my purse and attempt to prevent me from entering the building, claiming that she was worried about what I might do if I was allowed to be alone in my apartment in my current state of mind. The struggle over my purse quickly escalated into a physical altercation as I tried to retrieve my property and she tried to maintain control of it. "Let go of my purse," I demanded, pulling hard enough to break the strap and send both of us staggering in opposite directions. "You have no right to touch my belongings or to prevent me from entering my own building." Madison fell backward against her car and immediately began crying, claiming that I had attacked her and that my behavior was frightening and unpredictable. Several neighbors had gathered to watch the confrontation, and I could see them whispering among themselves about what they had witnessed. Madison played to this audience expertly, portraying herself as a concerned sister who was trying to help a mentally unstable sibling. The physical confrontation in the parking lot was just the beginning of what turned into a week-long siege as Madison seemed determined to prevent me from leaving for Hawaii by any means necessary. She began showing up at my apartment at random times, sometimes parking outside for hours without approaching the building, other times knocking on my door and demanding to be allowed inside to check on my well-being. The most disturbing incident occurred when I woke up one morning to find that someone had been in my apartment during the night. Nothing appeared to be stolen, but several items had been moved, and most importantly, my passport and driver's license were missing from the desk drawer where I always kept them. I immediately suspected Madison, but I had no proof and no way to retrieve the documents without involving the police. When I confronted Madison about the missing documents, she denied any knowledge of their whereabouts but suggested that perhaps I had misplaced them due to the stress I was obviously experiencing. She offered to help me search for them, but only if I agreed to postpone my trip until after Christmas and to participate in family counseling sessions to address what she described as my growing paranoia and hostility. "Maybe this is a sign that you shouldn't be traveling right now," Madison suggested with fake concern. "Losing important documents is often a symptom of stress-related cognitive problems. Perhaps we should focus on getting you the help you need instead of enabling behavior that could be dangerous." Determined to retrieve my documents and expose Madison's theft, I decided to break into her house while she was at work to search for my missing passport and identification. I knew the location of the spare key that our family had always kept hidden in the garden, and I was confident that I could get in and out without being detected if I timed everything correctly. The search of Madison's house revealed far more than I had expected to find. Hidden in her bedroom closet, I discovered not only my missing documents but also copies of legal papers related to the estate, financial records showing the extent of her debt problems, and what appeared to be forged signatures on several official documents. The evidence of her criminal activity was overwhelming and definitely illegal. I was in the process of photographing the evidence with my phone when I heard Madison's car in the driveway, arriving home several hours earlier than her normal schedule. There was no time to escape through the back door, and I was trapped in her bedroom with stolen property and clear evidence of breaking and entering. When Madison discovered me in her closet with the documents scattered around me, her reaction was immediate and violent. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" Madison screamed, lunging toward me with an expression of pure rage that I had never seen from her before. You broke into my home and went through my private belongings. This is completely insane behavior, Sarah. You're proving exactly what I've been telling everyone about your mental state. The fight that ensued was the most physical confrontation we had ever had, involving pushing, grabbing, and yes, kicking as we struggled over the documents and my attempt to escape from the house with evidence of her crimes. Madison tried to prevent me from leaving by blocking the doorway and grabbing at the papers I was attempting to take with me as proof of her illegal activities. During the struggle, I did kick Madison in the shin hard enough to make her release her grip on the documents and step back from the doorway. It was not my proudest moment, but I was desperate to escape with evidence of her fraud and theft. The kick was defensive rather than aggressive, but it definitely happened and it definitely caused her to fall backward against the wall. You're completely out of control, Madison sobbed as I headed toward the front door with my retrieved documents. I'm calling the police and telling them that you broke into my house and assaulted me. No one will believe anything you say after this. Richard arrived at the house just as I was leaving, apparently summoned by a frantic phone call from Madison. He took in the scene of his distraught fiancé, the scattered papers, and my obvious agitation, and initially seemed inclined to support Madison's version of events. However, when I showed him copies of the forged documents and explained what Madison had been planning, his expression began to change. Madison, what are these papers? Richard asked in a voice that suggested he was beginning to understand the scope of what had been happening. And why does Sarah have legal documents with what appears to be her forged signature on them? For the first time since this entire conflict had begun, I saw genuine fear in Madison's eyes as she realized that her lies were being exposed to the person whose opinion mattered most to her future plans. Richard was not just her fiancé, he was her financial security and her entry into the social status she had always craved. If she lost his support, she would have no way to recover from the debts and legal problems she had created. The most shocking discovery came when I found evidence that Madison had been drugging my coffee during our recent meetings at her house. Hidden in her kitchen cabinet was a small bottle of sleeping medication that matched symptoms I had been experiencing after visiting her, including drowsiness, confusion, and difficulty concentrating. She had been deliberately making me appear mentally unstable by drugging me before important conversations or family interactions. You've been putting sleeping pills in my coffee, I confronted her, holding up the bottle as evidence. That's why I've seemed confused and disoriented during family meetings. You've been drugging me to make everyone think I was having mental health problems. Madison's face went completely pale as she realized that this evidence could result in serious criminal charges that would destroy not only her relationship with Richard but potentially her freedom. Drugging someone without their knowledge was assault, and combined with the theft, forgery, and mail fraud, she was looking at multiple felony charges that could result in prison time. Armed with concrete evidence of Madison's crimes and with Richard beginning to question her story, I finally felt confident enough to proceed with my travel plans despite the chaos that surrounded them. I had managed to retrieve my passport and identification, and I had documented proof of Madison's illegal activities that would protect me from any false accusations she might make. However, I should have anticipated that Madison's desperation would drive her to make one final attempt to stop me from leaving. I arrived at the airport 3 hours before my scheduled departure time, hoping to clear security and reach my gate without any additional confrontations. Madison, however, had apparently been monitoring my activities and arrived at the airport with not only Richard but also Mrs. Hartwell as backup support. Their presence turned what should have been a routine departure into a public spectacle that attracted the attention of airport security and other travelers. Madison approached me at the check-in counter while I was attempting to get my boarding pass, flanked by Richard and Mrs. Hartwell in what appeared to be a coordinated intervention strategy. She had clearly briefed them on her version of recent events, because Mrs. Hartwell immediately began speaking to me in the patronizing tone typically reserved for small children or mentally impaired adults. "Sarah, dear, Madison has explained to us how much stress you've been under lately," Mrs. Hartwell said in a voice loud enough to attract attention from other passengers waiting in line. We're all very concerned about you traveling alone in your current state of mind. Perhaps it would be better to postpone this trip until you've had a chance to get the help you clearly need." The implication that I was mentally unstable, delivered in a public setting with dozens of witnesses, was humiliating and infuriating. I attempted to ignore them and continue with my check-in process, but Madison escalated the situation by loudly claiming that I had stolen money and documents from her house and that she was concerned about me leaving the country while these crimes were being investigated. "Excuse me," Madison said to the airline representative who was processing my boarding pass, "but I need to report that my sister has stolen property and money from my home, and I'm worried about her leaving the country before these issues can be resolved. Is there some way to prevent her from boarding this flight until the police can investigate?" The airline representative looked confused and concerned, clearly unsure about how to handle a situation involving potential criminal accusations and family disputes. She called for a supervisor while I tried to explain that Madison was lying and that I had evidence proving that she was the one who had committed crimes, not me. Airport security became involved when Madison's accusations escalated to claims that I was carrying stolen property in my luggage and that I might be dangerous due to my alleged mental instability. 2 security officers approached our group and asked us to move away from the check-in counter so that other passengers could be processed while they sorted out the situation. "Ma'am, we're going to need to see some identification and we'd like to ask you a few questions about these allegations," one of the security officers said to me in a professional but clearly suspicious tone. "Your sister here is claiming that you've stolen property from her and that you might be experiencing some kind of mental health crisis that makes you a potential flight risk." I found myself in the surreal position of standing in an airport security office trying to convince law enforcement officers that I was not mentally ill, not a thief, and not a danger to myself or others. Madison had successfully created enough doubt about my stability and intentions that the authorities felt obligated to investigate her claims before allowing me to board my flight. The turning point came when Richard, who had been listening carefully to both sides of the story, finally spoke up in my defense. "Officers, I think there may be some misunderstanding here," he said in a voice that carried the kind of authority that comes from wealth and social status. "I've recently discovered some concerning evidence about my fiancé's financial activities that suggests she may not be telling the truth about this situation." Richard's decision to support my version of events rather than Madison's was clearly unexpected and devastating to her. She had counted on his loyalty and support, and his public questioning of her credibility in front of airport security represented a complete collapse of her carefully constructed narrative. "Richard, you don't understand what's been happening," Madison said desperately, her composure finally beginning to crack under the pressure of public scrutiny. "Sarah has been behaving erratically for weeks. She broke into my house, she attacked me, she's been making wild accusations about things she doesn't understand." Mrs. Hartwell, who had initially supported Madison's claims, began to look uncomfortable as Richard continued to provide information that contradicted everything Madison had told her about the family situation. The sophisticated older woman was clearly experienced enough with social dynamics to recognize when someone was not telling the truth, and Madison's increasingly frantic explanations were not improving her credibility. The airport security investigation took over an hour as officers reviewed the evidence I had gathered about Madison's crimes and listened to Richard's testimony about what he had witnessed at her house. During this process, Madison's story began to fall apart completely as contradictions and lies became apparent to everyone involved. "Ma'am, based on what we're hearing here, it sounds like there are some serious allegations being made in both directions," the lead security officer said to Madison. "If you're claiming that crimes have been committed, you'll need to file a formal report with the police and provide evidence to support your accusations. But we can't detain someone from flying based solely on family disputes and unsubstantiated claims." As the truth about Madison's financial desperation and illegal activities became clear to everyone present, her behavior became increasingly erratic and desperate. She began crying uncontrollably and making wild accusations about conspiracies against her, behavior that ironically made her appear to be the one experiencing mental health problems rather than me. "She's been trying to destroy my life for months," Madison sobbed to anyone who would listen. She's jealous of my relationship with Richard and she wants to ruin my wedding. She can't stand that I'm successful and happy while she's alone and miserable working at that horrible job. The breakdown was painful to watch despite everything Madison had put me through. Seeing her reduced to this level of desperation and public humiliation was not satisfying in the way I had imagined it might be. Instead, it was simply sad and uncomfortable, highlighting how far our relationship had deteriorated and how much damage we had done to each other. Mrs. Hartwell, who had initially arrived as Madison's supporter, quietly approached Richard and suggested that they leave the airport immediately to avoid further embarrassment. It was clear that she had recognized the true nature of her future daughter-in-law's character and was already reconsidering the wisdom of welcoming Madison into her family. "Richard, dear, I think we should go," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly but firmly. "This is not the kind of situation that reflects well on any of us, and I believe we need to have some serious conversations about recent events." While I was still dealing with the airport security investigation and Madison's public breakdown, my phone rang with a call that would change everything about how I understood the scope of her criminal activities. The call was from David Chen, the attorney who had handled our parents' estate, and his tone immediately conveyed the seriousness of what he needed to discuss with me. "Ms. Johnson, I apologize for calling you during what I understand is your vacation time, but we've discovered some irregularities in the estate paperwork that require your immediate attention," Mr. Chen said in the carefully controlled voice that lawyers use when delivering bad news. "It appears that someone has been forging your signature on various documents for several months, and we need to discuss the legal implications of these activities." The revelation that Madison had been systematically forging my signature on legal documents was shocking even after everything else I had discovered about her behavior. Mr. Chen explained that his office had become suspicious when they received several different sets of paperwork with signatures that didn't quite match their records, prompting them to conduct a handwriting analysis that revealed the extent of the fraud. The forged signatures appear on documents related to property transfers, financial account changes, and several other matters that would normally require your personal authorization, Mr. Chen continued. "We estimate that these fraudulent activities have been ongoing for at least 6 months, possibly longer. The financial impact is significant, and we're required by law to report this to both law enforcement and the relevant financial institutions." While Mr. Chen was explaining the legal ramifications of Madison's document forgery, I was simultaneously receiving automated notifications on my phone from my bank's fraud protection system. Someone had been systematically transferring small amounts of money from various accounts, apparently using the forged authorizations to make the transactions appear legitimate. The individual amounts were small enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts, but the cumulative total was substantial. "This is very sophisticated financial fraud," Mr. Chen explained when I told him about the banking notifications. The perpetrator clearly understood how financial institutions monitor for suspicious activity and structured these transactions to avoid detection. This level of planning suggests that the crimes were premeditated and ongoing rather than impulsive decisions. The evidence of Madison's financial crimes was overwhelming and traceable through multiple financial institutions and legal documents. Every transaction could be linked to specific forged authorizations, and the handwriting analysis provided scientific proof of the forgery. Madison had created a paper trail that would be impossible to deny or explain away as misunderstandings or family disputes. Even while I was processing this devastating information about the scope of Madison's crimes, I found myself faced with a difficult decision about how to proceed. I could pursue criminal charges that would likely result in Madison's imprisonment, or I could attempt to negotiate some kind of private resolution that would allow her to make restitution without destroying her life completely. Ms. Johnson, I need to advise you that these are serious felony charges that carry significant prison sentences, Mr. Chen said when I mentioned my uncertainty about pressing charges. Document forgery, financial fraud, and mail theft are federal crimes that prosecutors typically pursue aggressively. However, the decision about whether to file charges ultimately rests with you as the victim. The weight of this decision was enormous. Madison had clearly committed serious crimes that had caused me both financial and emotional damage, but she was also my sister and the only immediate family I had left. The prospect of sending her to prison felt overwhelming, even after everything she had done to sabotage my life and steal my inheritance. While I was struggling with this decision, Madison was experiencing the complete collapse of her carefully constructed life plans. Richard, who had initially tried to remain neutral in our family dispute, was now fully informed about the extent of Madison's deception and criminal activity. His decision to break their engagement was swift and public, delivered in the airport terminal where everyone could witness the end of Madison's dreams of wealth and social status. "Madison, I can't continue our relationship after learning about these activities," Richard said in a voice that was sad but firm. "The lies, the forgery, the manipulation, this isn't the person I thought I was going to marry. I need time to think about everything that's happened, and I think you need professional help to address these issues." Mrs. Hartwell's reaction was even more devastating to Madison's aspirations. The sophisticated older woman had built her social reputation on careful character judgments and appropriate associations, and being connected to someone involved in financial fraud and family manipulation was completely unacceptable to her standards. "I'm afraid I cannot in good conscience welcome someone with this kind of background into our family," Mrs. Hartwell said with the cold precision of someone accustomed to making difficult social decisions. "Richard, I think we should return home immediately and discuss how to handle the social implications of this situation." Watching Madison lose everything she had worked toward achieving was simultaneously satisfying and heartbreaking. She had brought these consequences on herself through her choices and criminal activities, but seeing her reduced to sobbing in an airport terminal while her dreams collapsed around her was difficult to witness regardless of my anger about her behavior. Despite my anger and hurt, I found myself reluctant to board my plane while Madison was experiencing such a complete emotional breakdown. The sister I remembered from our childhood, before grief and desperation had turned her into someone willing to commit crimes against her own family, was still somewhere inside the woman crying in the airport terminal. "Madison, you need to get professional help," I said, approaching her carefully as Richard and Mrs. Hartwell prepared to leave. "What you've done is serious, but there are ways to address these problems if you're willing to take responsibility for your actions and work toward making things right." Madison's response was to beg me not to press criminal charges, promising to repay everything she had stolen and to seek therapy for what she acknowledged were serious behavioral problems. Her desperation was genuine, but I wasn't sure whether her promises represented real change or simply fear of the legal consequences she was facing. The decision about whether to board my plane or stay to deal with the family crisis felt like the most important choice I would ever make. Going to Hawaii would mean leaving Madison to face the consequences of her actions alone, while staying would mean sacrificing my long-planned vacation to deal with more family drama and manipulation. I ultimately decided to board my flight to Hawaii, partly because I desperately needed the vacation after months of conflict and stress, but also because I recognized that staying would likely enable Madison to avoid facing the full consequences of her criminal behavior. The flight itself was emotionally exhausting as I tried to process everything that had happened and to prepare for what awaited me when I returned. Maui should have been paradise, and in many ways it was exactly what I had dreamed about during those long nights working double shifts at the hospital. The beachfront resort was beautiful, the weather was perfect, and I had finally achieved the goal I had been working toward for 3 years. However, I found it almost impossible to enjoy the experience while my family life was in complete chaos thousands of miles away. The phone calls from extended family members started within hours of my arrival in Hawaii. Word about Madison's breakdown at the airport and the revelation of her criminal activities had spread quickly through our family network, and everyone wanted to hear my version of events or to offer their opinions about how the situation should be handled. Aunt Helen was the first to call, her voice filled with genuine remorse about how she had initially supported Madison's claims about my mental health. "Sarah, honey, I owe you such an apology," she said through tears. "I should have trusted my instincts about you instead of believing Madison's lies. I've known you your entire life, and I should have realized that her stories about your behavior didn't match the person you've always been." The conversations with various family members revealed the extent to which Madison had manipulated everyone's perceptions and relationships. She had told different lies to different people, creating a web of deception that had turned family members against each other while positioning herself as the reasonable voice trying to hold everyone together. She told me you were having financial problems and that the Hawaii trip was going to bankrupt you, our cousin Lisa explained during one particularly revealing phone call. She said you were too proud to ask for help but that she was trying to find a way to support you without hurting your feelings. I actually gave her money thinking it was going to help you. Each revelation about Madison's manipulation made me angrier but also sadder about how thoroughly she had destroyed the trust and communication that had once characterized our family relationships. The damage she had caused extended far beyond the financial crimes and affected every relationship within our extended family network. The most difficult call came from the hospital where Madison had been taken after suffering what appeared to be a complete nervous breakdown following Richard's departure from the airport. The emergency room doctor wanted to discuss her condition and to ask about my willingness to serve as her emergency contact and medical decision-maker. Your sister is experiencing what appears to be a severe stress-related psychological crisis, the doctor explained in the careful language medical professionals use to convey serious information. She's been sedated for her own safety, but she'll need ongoing psychiatric evaluation and possibly extended treatment. As her only immediate family member, we need to know about your availability to participate in treatment planning and decision-making. The irony that Madison was now actually experiencing the mental health crisis she had been falsely attributing to me was not lost on me, but it also highlighted how desperate and out of control she had become in her efforts to manipulate the family situation. Hearing that she was hospitalized and potentially facing serious psychiatric treatment made my anger about her crimes feel less important than my concern for her well-being. Despite everything she had done to me, I found myself feeling guilty about enjoying the luxury of my Hawaiian vacation while Madison was in a psychiatric hospital facing criminal charges and the complete collapse of her life plans. The beautiful sunsets and pristine beaches that I had dreamed about for years felt somehow inappropriate given the family tragedy that was unfolding back home. The long-distance phone confrontation with Madison came 3 days into my vacation when she was finally stable enough to make calls from the psychiatric facility where she was being treated. Her voice was subdued and heavily medicated, but she was finally able to have what appeared to be an honest conversation about her behavior and its consequences. Sarah, I know I can't undo what I've done, and I know you probably hate me, Madison said in a voice that sounded completely different from the manipulative tone she had used during our months of conflict. I want you to know that none of this was really about Hawaii or Christmas. I was terrified about losing everything, and I thought if I could control the family situation, I could somehow fix all the problems I had created. For the first time since our conflict had begun, Madison seemed to be taking genuine responsibility for her actions rather than blaming others or making excuses. She admitted to the forgery, the financial fraud, the manipulation of family members, and even the drugging incidents. Her honesty was both relieving and devastating as I finally understood the full scope of what she had been willing to do to achieve her goals. I started taking pills to sleep because I was so anxious about the debt. And then I started thinking that maybe if you seemed unstable, people would trust my judgment more, Madison continued, her voice breaking with emotion. I know how sick that sounds, and I know there's no excuse for what I did to you. I just kept thinking that if I could hold everything together until the wedding, I could find a way to fix everything. The revelation that Madison's criminal behavior had been driven primarily by panic about her financial situation and fear of losing her relationship with Richard helped me understand her motivations, but it didn't excuse the harm she had caused or eliminate the legal consequences she was facing. By the end of my first week in Hawaii, I had to make a decision about whether to return home early to deal with the family crisis or to stay and complete the vacation I had worked so hard to afford. Madison's psychiatric treatment was expected to last several weeks, and the legal proceedings related to her crimes would likely take months to resolve. I ultimately decided to stay in Hawaii for the full 2 weeks, partly because cutting the vacation short wouldn't actually help Madison's situation, but also because I recognized that I needed time to process everything that had happened and to decide how I wanted to handle our relationship going forward. The remainder of my time in Hawaii was spent trying to find some peace and perspective about the family situation while also enjoying the experiences I had dreamed about for so long. I snorkeled in crystal clear waters, watched traditional Hawaiian dance performances, and took long walks on beaches that were more beautiful than anything I had ever seen. But even these amazing experiences were tinged with sadness about the family relationships that had been damaged and the uncertain future that awaited me at home. Returning to Chicago after 2 weeks in Hawaii felt like entering a completely different world, not just because of the weather change but because of how dramatically my family situation had evolved while I was away. Madison had been released from psychiatric care but was living in a supervised transitional facility while awaiting trial for her financial crimes. The house where we had grown up was in foreclosure proceedings, and our extended family was still struggling to process the scope of her deception and manipulation. My first priority was visiting Madison at the transitional facility to see how she was doing and to begin the difficult process of deciding how our relationship might move forward. The woman I found there was dramatically different from the manipulative and desperate person who had broken down at the airport. Medication and intensive therapy had helped stabilize her mental state, but she was clearly still fragile and uncertain about her future. "Sarah, I wasn't sure you'd be willing to see me after everything I put you through," Madison said when I arrived for our scheduled visit. She looked smaller and older than I remembered, with none of the commanding presence that had always characterized her personality. "I've been working with therapists to understand why I did those things, and I'm starting to realize how much damage I caused to everyone, especially you." The conversation was awkward and emotional as we both struggled to find a way to communicate that wasn't shaped by months of conflict and manipulation. Madison was genuinely remorseful about her behavior, but she was also clearly terrified about the criminal charges she was facing and the possibility of prison time. I found myself feeling protective of her despite my anger about what she had done. "I don't hate you, Madison," I said carefully, trying to find words that were honest but not unnecessarily cruel. "But I also can't pretend that everything you did was okay or that we can just go back to the way things were before. What you did was serious, and it's going to take time to rebuild any kind of trust between us." The process of rebuilding our relationship required professional mediation through family therapists who specialized in cases involving financial abuse and manipulation between relatives. These sessions were often difficult and painful as we worked through the specific incidents of Madison's criminal behavior and its impact on our family relationships. One of the most important breakthroughs came when Madison was able to articulate how her grief over our parents' death had contributed to her desperate need for control and financial security. The therapists helped both of us understand that her criminal behavior had been driven partly by unresolved trauma and anxiety, though this explanation didn't excuse her actions or eliminate the consequences she faced. "When Mom and Dad died, I felt like I had to become the responsible one who held everything together," Madison explained during one particularly emotional therapy session. "But I never dealt with my own grief, and I started thinking that if I could control all the family situations, somehow I could prevent any more loss or chaos." I gradually came to understand that Madison's opposition to my Hawaii trip had been less about the vacation itself and more about her terror of losing control over family dynamics that represented her only sense of security. This insight didn't forgive her criminal behavior, but it helped me see her as someone who had been struggling with serious psychological problems rather than simply as a villain who had set out to harm me. The financial restitution process took several months to complete, but Madison was ultimately able to repay most of what she had stolen through the sale of assets and a structured payment plan that would continue for several years. The legal charges were reduced from felonies to misdemeanors in exchange for her cooperation with prosecutors and her agreement to continue psychiatric treatment. "I know I can't give you back the months of stress and conflict I caused," Madison said as we finalized the restitution agreements. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to making this right and to proving that I can be the sister you deserve to have." Setting boundaries for our new relationship was crucial to my ability to trust Madison again. We established clear agreements about financial transparency, communication expectations, and the consequences that would follow if she ever attempted to manipulate or deceive me again. These boundaries were formalized through legal documents to ensure that both of us understood the seriousness of our commitments. The extended family gradually began to heal from the divisions and mistrust that Madison's manipulation had created. Aunt Helen, Cousin Lisa, and other relatives who had been deceived by Madison's lies slowly rebuilt their relationships with both of us, though it took time for everyone to process the extent of the deception they had experienced. I think we all learned something about the importance of direct communication rather than assuming we know what's happening in each other's lives, Aunt Helen reflected during one family gathering. Madison was able to manipulate us partly because we weren't talking to each other enough to compare stories and realize that things didn't add up. The healing process was gradual and sometimes frustrating, with setbacks and difficulties along the way. Madison had to work hard to demonstrate that her changes were genuine and lasting, while I had to learn to forgive without forgetting the lessons about protecting myself from manipulation and abuse. One of the most meaningful steps in our reconciliation came when Madison suggested that we take a trip to Hawaii together the following Christmas. She wanted to experience the place that had become such a symbol of our conflict, but also to create new memories that weren't associated with the trauma and manipulation of the previous year. "I'd like to see what you found so special about Hawaii," Madison said when she made the suggestion. "And I think it might be healing for both of us to share something positive instead of just working through all the negative things I did." The trip to Hawaii together was both wonderful and challenging as we navigated our new relationship dynamic in a setting that held so much symbolic meaning for both of us. Madison was genuinely amazed by the beauty of the islands and seemed to understand why I had been so determined to experience this place. We were able to enjoy each other's company in ways that hadn't been possible for years, but we were also constantly aware of the work we still needed to do to rebuild our trust and communication. "I can see why you were willing to fight so hard to come here," Madison said as we watched a sunset from the same beach where I had spent much of my previous vacation. "I'm sorry that I was so focused on my own problems that I couldn't see how much this meant to you." Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that the conflict over my Hawaii vacation became a catalyst for addressing much deeper problems in our family relationships that might have continued to fester if they hadn't been forced into the open. Madison's criminal behavior was inexcusable, but the crisis ultimately led to healing and growth that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. The most important lesson I learned was about the necessity of standing up for myself even when it means confronting people I love. Madison's manipulation was able to continue for as long as it did partly because I was reluctant to establish firm boundaries or to insist on being treated with respect. Learning to protect myself while maintaining compassion for others has been one of the most valuable skills I developed through this difficult experience. Today, Madison and I have a relationship that is honest and supportive in ways that our previous dynamic never was. She continues in therapy and has built a stable, independent life that doesn't depend on manipulating others or avoiding responsibility for her actions. We're not as close as we once were, and probably never will be, but we're able to be genuinely supportive of each other's goals and happiness. As I finish telling this story, I'm struck by how much our family has grown and changed through this crisis. We learned that love sometimes requires fighting for what's right, that healing is possible even after serious betrayal, and that standing up for yourself doesn't mean you have to abandon the people who have hurt you. I'd love to hear your thoughts about family conflicts and how you've handled situations where you had to choose between keeping peace and protecting yourself. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who were trying to control your decisions? How did you find the courage to set boundaries while maintaining your relationships? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family drama and finding the strength to fight for what matters most to you. Remember to share this video with anyone who might be dealing with similar family challenges. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you find the courage to stand up for yourself while keeping your heart open to healing and forgiveness. May your holidays be filled with genuine love, respect, and the kind of family relationships that lift you up instead of tearing you down.